delighted this morning to be joined by two very special guests in the first of what we hope will be an annual tradition, Urbanity's Great Debate. Would you please welcome Jonathan Shree and Natalie Rayment. So this morning we're tackling the topic of NIMBYism. As cities continue to grow, the tensions between the development industry, planning authorities, elected officials, and the broader community continue to intensify. NIMBY activists, that is those that proclaim no in my backyard to new development, are now employing technology and social media to become more coordinated, more organised, while at the same time the pressures of population growth, affordability and social inequity continue to impact the most vulnerable. So where is the balance? What values underlie sustainable community development? And how do we design and deliver safe, sustainable and inclusive cities? So joining us today is Jonathan Shree, Greens Councillor for the Gabba ward here in Brisbane, and Natalie Rayment, Director of Wolter Consulting and co-founder of YIMBY Queensland. Would you again please join me in welcoming Jonathan and Natalie? So let me introduce them. Speaking on behalf of the YIMBY side, which is the yes in my backyard side, is Natalie Rayment. Natalie is a practicing town planner and a company director, a member of Property Council's Committee for Cities, and a YIMBY, someone who says yes in my backyard to good development that makes for better living. Natalie is the co-founder of YIMBY Queensland, a not-for-profit public interest organisation established to celebrate, encourage and support good development, and hopes to bring back some balance to the urban policy debate. She believes that good development outcomes enhance everyday life and good development features one or more of the four YIMBY Queensland qualities, which are design excellence, sustainability, innovation and community dividend. Jonathan Shree, speaking against overdevelopment, is local Greens politician and councillor for the Gabba ward in Inner Brisbane, Jonathan Shree. He's a fierce advocate for sustainable development. I'm sure you've read about him in the Brisbane news. And he believes that meaningful development improves affordability for people on lower incomes, and public infrastructure is important because it keeps up with public and population growth. He believes the benefits of densification should flow throughout society rather than just profit becoming concentrated in the hands of a privileged minority. Often at the forefront of what many consider overdevelopment, he is currently concerned that town planners, architects and ordinary residents have been sidelined from the conversations, which I'm sure is music to the ears of many of the architects and town planners in the room. Would you please join me in welcoming Natalie and Jonathan again. So, the process. The process for the Great Debate is as follows. Each speaker will be required to respond to 3 questions. They'll be given 3 minutes each per question, and then a warning bell, which I don't think we'll have a bell, but I'll just do a nice little clap, golf clap, will be sounded on 2 minutes and again on 3 minutes. Following that, Jonathan and Natalie will go head-to-head in a Q&A style format where they'll be able to ask questions of each other and respond accordingly. And then time permitting, we'll open it up to the floor and get some questions. Now, I don't need to say this, I'm sure. However, please remain respectful of each other's views and please be mindful not to speak over the top of each other. So the first question. The NIMBY versus YIMBY debate is often very highly localised, highly politicised and devoid of a sensible discussion. So can you please outline your positions in favour of both the YIMBY and the NIMBY movements, respectively? Ladies first, Natalie.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. And I guess I co-founded YIMBY Queensland 18 months ago with some colleagues at Wolter's, and so I'm obviously here to be on Team YIMBY. So YIMBY Queensland's now a not-for-profit organisation based in Brisbane, but happy to look all over Queensland. And we're part of a growing global YIMBY network. So we've got a network across in America, in Europe, and certainly spreading into Australia. We say yes in my backyard to good development that makes for better living. So of course I'm here to persuade you that the YIMBY case is the standout winner, or should be the standout winner today, but not only today in this debate, but it's the only responsible way forward for the growth of our cities and towns. So a little bit of background, I guess. For me, I've experienced the negative NIMBY attitude through my career as a town planner for over 20 years here in Brisbane. On the front line, I guess, work in development assessment, both sides of the table, and it's, I guess, that constant challenge that's led me to become an avid YIMBY campaigner. So what do we stand for? Globally, it's a movement that's arisen specifically because of the escalating cost of housing, particularly in our major cities around the world. We've become a voice for young people saying, you know, what's my future in this city if I can't afford a home? In fact, the advocate for the YIMBY movement in San Francisco is actually from the Renters Federation, fed up that all the renters are being kicked out of her city because there's not enough housing. So I guess the differences that I think that we have, so while we might stand here and say we agree with some ideals, sustainable living, housing for everybody, I think the differences I want to put on the table is how we're going to get there. So YIMBY say yes, it's about getting to yes. NIMBY say no. We're the positive force in this conversation. NIMBY, by its own testimony, is negative. Not in my backyard. No, I guess the point is it's no. It might be yes to some ideals. Yes, we agree with some ideals. Yes to that high moral ground. Yes to sustainable living, sustainable development, just not in my neighbourhood. So there's a little level of hypocrisy there, or perhaps a conflict between where the ideals are going and how we're actually going to get there. So I guess my point is that NIMBY behaviours increase housing costs, reduce productivity and stifle innovation, and for me that doesn't equal good development. I think there's never been a more important time to be a YIMBY. We're talking a lot in this conference about population growth, how we're going to fit people into our cities. Urban Developer are also putting on the table that this is the decade of disruption. So it's not time to focus on rules, strict rules, compliance with rules. It's about actually being flexible, embracing our performance-based planning system and making new ways to be innovative. That's our challenge for this decade. Whether that's delivered by the private sector, public sector, large corporations, mums and dads, I don't care, as long as they get out of the way and stop stifling development, shooting down new projects, delaying projects, raising the hoops that we need to go through to get a new project off the ground. So I'm sure we all want our cities to be great places, sustainable places to live and innovative. And, you know, we're not going to say yes to absolutely everything. It's not that every development is great, but the difference is we want to have a discussion about it, not a fight. We want to get to yes. Thanks.
Jonathan, I'll repeat the question just so everyone's clear. The NIMBY versus YIMBY debate is often highly localised, highly politicised and devoid of sensible discussion. Can you please outline your position in favour of the NIMBY movement, although I'm sure you actually don't quite like being called a NIMBY. So, in favour of sensible development.
Thanks. Morning, everyone. It's an honour to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak. I wanted you all to take me seriously, so I wore my smartest, most professional pair of pants today. I grew up in Northside suburbia to a soundtrack of lawnmowers and lonely dogs, and I was always troubled by Australia's addiction to uninspiring suburban sprawl and chewing up farmland and forests. And I moved to the inner city because I saw the value of denser, walkable neighbourhoods where the streets were lively and vibrant. So I can understand why some people might be confused by how strongly I've objected to some major development projects. Personally, I don't consider myself a NIMBY, and I think such terms are problematic because they muddy the waters and discourage more nuanced debate. There are plenty of people in Brisbane who do mindlessly object to any form of development in their neighbourhood, and a common trope is that these are privileged territorial homeowners. But many of the strongest objectors to inner city development are not necessarily wealthy homeowners, but low-income renters who recognise that these projects will not deliver well-designed affordable housing and are in fact pricing them out of their neighbourhoods and fragmenting their communities. I have two fundamental concerns about the trajectory of development we're seeing in Brisbane. The first is that too many projects are falling short of best practice design standards and aren't assisting Brisbane to become a more sustainable and resilient city. And the second is that the private construction boom is not improving affordability and stability for low-income renters and appears to be economically unsustainable. Contrary to popular rhetoric, I would argue that increasing the supply of private dwellings isn't really improving affordability for first home buyers because profit-driven investors continue to drive up prices. And at any time that demand from investors slows down, the private construction industry will slow down construction as well. So the only way that we could improve housing affordability through private sector development is if we saturated the market with so many dwellings that we precipitated a massive collapse in property values across the city. This would obviously be financially devastating for all the owner-occupiers with massive mortgages and would be quite destabilising for the broader Brisbane economy. But obviously this scenario seems unlikely because the private sector tends to artificially restrict supply in order to preserve high property values. While an oversupply of apartments in certain suburbs might temporarily lower prices, the long-term trajectory is definitely still upwards. As a result, first home buyers are taking on massive, crippling mortgages just to get into the market. This level of debt forces people into working longer hours under less favourable employment conditions and also means residents have less time for volunteering and connecting with their neighbours. Meanwhile, renters are stuck on short-term leases with little power to improve and customise their homes and no long-term security of tenure. When medium-density share houses, flats and boarding houses are demolished to make way for new apartments, the low-income tenants who get evicted are often priced out of the neighbourhood altogether. They can't afford the newer luxury apartments. So basically, residents aren't reaping the benefits of this kind of development, nor are they being given any meaningful say into how their neighbourhoods change and evolve. We're getting rapid population growth, but not the infrastructure to support it. My argument is that by denying residents a say and forcing change upon communities, we're actually turning reasonable, rational people into the worst kind of NIMBYs. We're actually creating NIMBYs because we don't trust people, we don't trust ordinary residents to have a mature and evidence-based conversation about development and planning. So we cut them out of the conversation altogether, and then they arc up and become more adversarial and hostile. The main political justification for the private apartment construction boom is, I would argue, false. Most people within the property industry don't actually want property values to fall. I think that's probably not uncontroversial, and that's the core of my premise, is that if we leave housing supply and construction up to the private property industry, affordability for young people, for lower income renters, isn't going to improve over the long term. Thanks.
All right, I'm going to stay seated as well. With the broader community, especially the most vulnerable, often the victims of a lack of coordination between the development industry, planning authorities, and activist groups, what values underpin sustainable development in the community? Natalie.
Hey, so I might stay seated too. Is that all right? Yeah, but just keep it casual. So I guess I was going to say that YIMBY Queensland wants to talk about what is good development, and so we sort of just put out there some things that we think are great attributes of development, and we tried to categorise them to keep it simple so people can talk about them and have a conversation about them. So we said, yeah, it's sustainable development, it's development that has some design excellence, some innovation, or delivers on community dividend. So it might be any of those four things, and as soon as a development has one of those things, I'm going to support it. We've got lists on our website. We showcase projects that, that might inspire people on our Instagram site, and we've published a set of reasons for approval, and that's one initiative I do like of late, where decisions that get made approving developments have to actually say why. Let's actually use that and promote the reasons why developments are good outcomes for the community and talk about them. So again, while I think perhaps there's some similarities in what our ideals are, what is sustainable development, and for me that's quite broad. Yes, it might be about efficiency in resources, density in the right locations to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also ageing in place and providing a sustainable future for our cities. while there might be some similarities there, again, for me, it's about how we're going to deliver on those developments. And so what I find is that when there's a overwhelming push for acceptable outcomes, rule-based planning, then that's when we're actually losing the opportunity to go over and above. And so for me, what I find is a little bit ironic is that often the mediocre sort of tick and flick, or what we call acceptable outcomes, that's really just an example of a way to meet a performance outcome, becomes the focus. You know, that is development that's going to perhaps go through more quickly, go below the radar of the media, maybe the local groups. It's the easier way to get through. As soon as you actually propose something out of the box that challenges some of those things, it's very innovative, that's, you know, it's designed for its location, that's when all hell breaks loose. And so for me, that's actually putting downward pressure on creativity, innovation, and sustainable development, great development for our future. As I said, I'm a practicing planner for many years, so I've worked on some great projects that I think are great for Brisbane. None more so than a project I've been able to work on a few years ago. It began Sunland's project on the old ABC site at Toowong. I think it's an amazing project. It ticks all my YIMBY boxes. I'm very proud to be involved in it. Yet we're still here battling through the courts 2.5 years after it was approved, and you know, that is purely that concern about rules. It is higher than the height acceptable outcome or the example height in that location, but there's a lot of trade-offs, or what we in planning world call sufficient grounds. So, you know, they doubled the amount of parkland and open space that they had to provide. So it's actually, you know, half of the site is being handed over as public open space on the riverfront, an opportunity to bring the centre of Toowong down to the river. There's heritage protection, there's improvements to the bikeway going through, and, you know, the list goes on. You know, and getting a Pritzker Prize winning first female to win the Pritzker Prize for architecture, first Muslim to win the Pritzker Prize for architecture, her first project in Australia, and we're still stuck in the courts 2.5 years later. So beware the billionaire NIMBY that lives next door to your project, because that's even more troubling. So I guess my point is that NIMBYism comes at a cost, and that's a cost we can't afford. It's a cost on housing. As a result, it's a cost on our community, and particularly the younger generation. So it's the holding costs of delay, it's the lost economies of scale when there's downward pressure on yield, it's the cost of appeal, and that's not only the cost to the developer, that's the cost to the community, because it's the council that has to defend their decisions through the court. It's the state government defending their decisions because there was heritage, you know, if there's heritage or state-controlled roads or whatever on the table. And probably even worse, and what escalates and mounts, and I think the general community would not realise this, is it's the cost of increasingly long sets of rules, some might say nannying rules and restrictions. Just to lodge one application for a townhouse project in this city or apartments, you have to actually answer 100 pages of code. Like, it's gone out of control. That's mind-boggling. It's boring as town planners. Let's get back and actually talk about what's important. Am I okay for time? Yep, I'll better stop there. Thank you.
The billionaire NIMBY, I like it. That'll sit with me for a while. So, Jonathan, just to repeat, with the broader community, especially the most vulnerable, often the victims of a lack of coordination between the development industry, planning authorities and activist groups, what values underpin sustainable development in the community?
And for the record, I'm definitely not a billionaire. Before I was elected, I was living off about $200 a week. Anyway, it's easy to list sustainable development buzz phrases like walkable neighbourhoods, adaptive reuse, climate responsive design, Green Star accreditation. But for private sector developments, these sorts of features aren't likely to be included and delivered unless A, they are strict mandatory requirements embodied in some form of regulation or legislation, or B, they increase profits. So they increase sale values or they bring down construction costs. The concern I have with many apartment developments is that design decisions largely ignore the welfare and wishes of the ultimate residents. I've had plenty of conversations with developers where I say, oh, why didn't you put solar panels on that rooftop? Or why don't your apartments have greater water recycling? And usually their response is that it's not what buyers are looking for. Such features are considered nice to have extras that aren't worth the additional construction costs because they don't really add to the property's sale value. This is especially problematic in a market where the majority of buyers are investors or short-term owner-occupiers who intend to on-sell in a year or two. I do see a few developers who are including more green space and other amenities because they're targeting owner-occupiers who are willing to pay more for well-designed buildings, but it seems to me that the majority of Brisbane developers are primarily trying to attract off-the-plan investors, and the majority of investors don't usually care that much about the quality of the fixtures or whether there are enough deep planted trees and green spaces on the site. All they really care about is the location and how many bedrooms and bathrooms there are. So there's no direct connection or feedback mechanism between the people designing and building apartments and the residents who end up living there long term. This disconnect is particularly apparent in the way so many modern apartments cut people off from the surrounding community. Between intercom security systems, soulless hallways and lobbies, and the lack of publicly accessible spaces, there are often very few opportunities for residents to interact with their immediate neighbours, let alone community members from other buildings. Many residents take the elevator down to the basement car park and drive to work without ever engaging with the surrounding streetscape and nearby local businesses. In suburbs like West End, older styles of medium-density apartments have open stairwells and outdoor walkways that increase passive surveillance and offer more opportunities for incidental encounters and community interactions. Residents can call out to each other from balconies and landings and swap news while they're gardening in communal courtyards or hanging washing on shared clotheslines. So to encourage strong connected communities, the built environment needs to feature a gradual transition between the public and private realm with shared facilities and communal spaces. This allows residents to choose how much or how little engagement they have with neighbours and the world around them. But the design of many new apartment developments robs residents of this choice. You're either locked away inside your apartment or you're out on the street. There's very little in between. This encourages a more individualistic lifestyle and prevents the formation of robust and resilient community networks. My broader point here is that the community dividend of development is substantially reduced when design decisions are driven by the pursuit of profit rather than what's best for long-term residents.
So, question 3. When it comes to planning, designing and delivering safe and inclusive cities, how can us, the development industry, planning authorities and elected officials measure and achieve their strategic objectives? Natalie.
Thank you. Okay, that's trickier one. So I guess for YIMBY, for me it's about getting to yes, and it's how we can get to yes to support good development outcomes. And so for me it's more about how we're going to achieve that strategic goal, on our path or on our journey. So for me it's about balancing this conversation about development in our community, and it's not just about balancing it and perhaps from different perspectives we feel like it needs to be balanced on different sides of the seesaw, but it's also about evening up the information playing field to dispel some of the urban myths about how development assessment occurs and how developments get approved. It's about removing barriers to good development and supporting innovation, being a bit more flexible and open for innovation. And it's about showcasing the projects that are displaying those elements of good development. So for me, in terms of measures of success or how we're going along that path, I'd like to see a balancing of the conversation played out in the media. So, I'm a supporter of urban developer who are promoting and showcasing, but just putting on the table for discussion projects to get that discussion point out there in the community. But overwhelmingly, the print media, the news media is very not so much negative, but they create a sense of danger around the topic of development. There's been some studies done and a doctorate thesis being done at QUT just analysing the terminology that's put out there when you're talking about development, and it's all Dangerfield, it's city under siege, it's floods of development, it's ripping the heart out of communities. And I just want to balance that conversation. Let's actually talk about pop YIMBY's up there as the hero in this discussion and say, this is about actually finding homes for the newcomers into our communities. It's about, helping move our cities forward under the pressure of development and population growth, and a globe under disruption, not just a local environment. So we need to be having this conversation with the community. We've also put out a positive submission toolkit, so I'd actually like when people are consulted through the formal channels to actually say they like a project, or if they don't like a project, how they would get to yes, you know, not just to be negative. And in consultation forums, I guess I don't want to have a fight, I want to have a discussion. So it's about trying to talk about what the outcomes should be on the way to hopefully getting to a yes. Evening up the playing field, for me, that is, there's so much misunderstanding about planning and development processes out in the community, and fair enough, it's boring. It's nice that I have an audience, happy to listen to a planner, but not many people really want to talk and listen about planning laws and regulations. But for me, it's actually the way that we're communicating is not helpful, it's actually very unhelpful. Particularly when we start talking about things like height limits. We're working in a performance-based planning system where acceptable outcomes are purely examples. There's actually one council, I think it's Logan now, that are actually calling their acceptable outcomes examples. Throw out the old words, people don't understand it. They're examples, there's no height limit. It's a performance-based planning system, so planners have to stop talking about limits and politicians have to stop talking about limits, otherwise how does the community understand when a development gets approved higher than the limit? That does sound wrong. Community and politicians need to understand the virtues of performance-based planning. You know, we're talking about disruption, we're talking about innovation, let's stop talking about prescriptive rules. We haven't had prescriptive rules in this state since, I think, 1997, when the legislation changed about three changes ago. So let's start embracing it and actually showcase the projects that are out of the box and are the projects that we've come to love in our city. I want to dispel the myths. You know, there's no brown paper bag across the table. There's a very long and arduous process to get a development approved, and it's expensive, and it can be unproductive if we're looking at things that don't matter. Let's focus on what does matter and get it in and, you know, speed up those approvals. So remove the barriers, break down those rules, focus on what's important, more as of right developments for the right development in the right locations, faster approvals, less appeals. Ultimately, I'd like to see more housing, more types of housing, more services that support housing, and good development outcomes. So I guess my take-home message is don't let the car parking space in front of your house become more important than the opportunity to welcome a new friend to your neighbourhood. Get on board Team YIMBY.
Nice.
Nice. So when it comes to planning, designing and delivering safe and inclusive cities, how can the development industry, planning authorities and elected officials measure and achieve their strategic objectives? Jono.
That last comment really resonated with me because right now I'm in the middle of Gabba. I'm trying to get a bike lane project through where we're taking away 80 street parking bays to put in barrier-separated lanes, and local business owners are up in arms. A lot of residents aren't happy about it. And so in that case, I guess I'm the YIMBY and I've got a whole bunch of NIMBYs to deal with. But it goes back to that problem of community consensus-based decision-making and the sense of distrust of the political establishment. As you've identified, we're at the point now where residents have so little faith in councils and state governments to stick up for their interests that even when good projects are coming through, they just say no to everything. And I guess I would argue that there are two main reasons for that. One is that the infrastructure we need to support a growing population just isn't keeping up with the supply and the population growth. There are a couple of reasons for that, and I hope we can unpack this a bit more in the discussion, but basically in the inner city, land values are so high that governments don't have the revenue coming in to acquire new land for public parklands or to acquire space for a new ferry terminal or even just to change the road outline so that they can put in a bike lane. Like you guys probably know as well as me that just shifting the curb line and moving all those utilities costs hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. So in the inner city where land values are high and there are so many competing stakeholders, delivering any kind of infrastructure project becomes exponentially more expensive. But the revenue generated from infrastructure charges and in sort of inner city areas is kind of the same as what you have in the outer burbs. So I think it's, someone will correct me, it's like 20K per dwelling or 28K for a dwelling with 3 or more bedrooms. Whether you're building right out in the burbs where land is a lot cheaper or right in the inner city, you're still paying the same amount of infrastructure charges per dwelling. But in the inner city, it's much more difficult and much more expensive to provide the infrastructure. So we end up with this big lag that grows and grows over time. And councils and governments just don't have the mechanisms to generate the revenue to deliver that infrastructure. And that's really what residents are objecting to. You talk to people in West End and Wollongabba, they're not necessarily frustrated about more people moving into the neighbourhood. They're frustrated that more people are moving into the neighbourhood and their quality of life is diminishing because there's not the infrastructure to support them. But the other piece of the puzzle relates back to performance-based planning. I think we should unpack this a bit more as well, because I have no problems with the concept of flexibility, and I often find myself arguing against really inflexible uses and zoning codes where, you know, something's zoned commercial and someone wants to do light industrial and council gets all bureaucratic and ridiculous. That stuff really frustrates me and eats up a lot of my time. But we need to recognise that performance outcomes around the built environment are discretionary, subjective decisions, values-based decisions that can end up representing huge financial value to specific property developers and specific owners. So when, through a neighbourhood planning process or a city planning process, land is upzoned from low density to high density, that increases the land value by tens of millions of dollars. And right now, not much of that increase in value is really flowing back to the community. It just sort of largely resides in the hands of those individual landowners who happen to have been land banking since the 70s and own this patch of inner city real estate. They just left it empty for 20 years, and now suddenly they've got this huge windfall. And then similarly, when we have these sort of acceptable outcome heights in the neighbourhood plan, and then one developer gets approved for significantly higher buildings, while others are stuck at the same height, that developer who got that performance outcome is again netting huge value in terms of property values and the value that they can sell that asset for down the track. And that's essentially a gift. We're giving some developers, not all developers, some developers and some owners huge gifts in terms of increased land value and the increased potential profit. But we're not taxing that, we're not capturing that revenue in any way to deliver infrastructure to support that increased density. And that differs in Queensland from other jurisdictions where there are value capture taxations, uplift taxes, more flexible infrastructure charge schemes. So the common objection I hear from a lot of residents is that there's one set of rules for ordinary residents who have to jump through all sorts of hoops and bureaucratic barriers just to extend their house or put on a back deck. And then there's another set of rules for a few wealthy developers who seem to get special treatment because they know how to manipulate the system and they have really good town planners who can argue effectively. But at the end of the day, those performance outcomes are really subjective. How am I going for time? We should unpack this further. I'll wrap it up there, but I want to talk more about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. So let's unpack it, right? The tax. You buy a site, you pay stamp duty. You pay GST on the way through. You pay infrastructure charges. You pay income tax. You pay payroll tax. What else am I missing, right? So about 30% of the cost base of a development is tax. Do you really think taxing further is going to break the model, or is going to introduce a better outcome, or do we need to look at it a bit differently?
Yeah, I'd start by arguing that stamp duty should definitely be abolished and payroll tax should definitely be abolished as well. Those are regressive and ridiculous taxes. But I think, so my argument is that we should be constructing a whole lot more public housing. Queensland, Brisbane has a very small proportion of public housing. I think it's 3% of housing stock in Queensland is public housing. That compares unfavourably to other states. And you go to places like Vienna and Berlin, they have like 20% public housing. So the vast majority of our housing stock is privatised, and that it reinforces the treatment of housing as a speculative commodity. So investors are making a lot of money out of this. We see, I think it's around 20,000 properties in Brisbane are long-term empty. We see a lot of empty bedrooms. There's not efficient use of existing housing stock. All these problems feed into the rise in land values and the fact that we can't afford to provide infrastructure in the inner city. So I would argue that if we increase some of those charges and fees and taxes to generate revenue to provide infrastructure, maybe we will see a drop in land values, and we will see some developers saying, oh, it's not worth it for me, I can't make a profit on that. But that will free up that land or free up those opportunities for owner-occupiers and first home buyers to have housing cooperative models, to rent-to-buy schemes, and for the state government to acquire land and deliver public housing projects. I've talked to a number of people who have great ideas for medium density and high density, you know, the Nightingale model, those sorts of housing cooperative models. But they can't afford the land in the inner city because a much wealthier developer who's kind of got a lot of favourable tax treatment and has sort of worked out how to manage their finances more effectively, ends up holding all that land and cutting ordinary owner-occupiers and potential owners out of the conversation. So I guess that's one of my big concerns about that. But I think there's definitely, you look at other jurisdictions, they do tax higher, they end up delivering more infrastructure, and that's also supporting a healthy property market.
Natalie, your thoughts on that? I mean, that's fairly contentious stuff. Yeah.
So I guess for me, I think I probably use an analogy: if you put enough weight in a freight train, it eventually stops. So yeah, it's nice to say, oh, let's throw out that tax and let's throw out this tax and have another tax. But until they get thrown out, we just can't afford it. I mean, housing. And development is an expensive business, and it's a risky business. And it's not just you buy a site and you develop it.
Yeah.
I mean, people look at so many sites until they can find a site they want to buy, and then they have to go through a bidding process to actually win that. So we might, if we work for a client, we might look at 20 sites or more than that before they buy one site, and that's a lot of expenditure, a lot of time and effort, consultancy fees, just in understanding what they can do with that site. So there's already, a lot of costs. We can't just add more layers of costs on. So for me, it's about a bit of a reality check about costs. We can't gold plate development, or it's just going to increase the price of development. We've got to make use of the infrastructure that we have.
John, I'm about to lodge a DA for 30 apartments in your ward.
Dun,
right?
dun, dun.
What do you actually want to? What do you actually want to see? What do you want to actually see?
So I talked before about design that encourages connected communities, that doesn't shove everyone away in their own privatised space, and so we end up with situations where people don't even know their neighbours' names. I think the public realm is really important, and transitions between the public and private realm can be a lot better.
And what is that? What is that?
I think the first thing I'd say is everyone seems to be chucking a restaurant and cafe down at ground level and calling that street level activation, as though that's the end of the conversation. But there are many ways to activate streetscapes in terms of like community spaces, adaptable design that encourages people to hang out. That sort of stuff isn't being delivered by a lot of the apartments I'm seeing. But as well as that, I think we need to have those tricky conversations about, do we really need everyone to have their own laundry? Do we really need to have like everyone having their own dryer? Can those things sort of be communal property? Can we have rooftop gardens? I love that sort of stuff because it encourages neighbours to meet and interact. But the other big concern I have about a lot of developments we're seeing in Brisbane is that they're still quite car-centric. We talk about the benefits of density and people not commuting in from the suburbs. But even in West End, I see people living in a high-rise apartment, taking the elevator down to ground level, driving out. They then drive to work where there's also an underground car park and take the elevator. So they're never actually interacting with the street or with the broader community, and they're clogging up roads, and that's driving up infrastructure charges as well. I should probably be fair and acknowledge that the government and the council does spend a lot of money on infrastructure in the inner city, but they're still spending it on shitty road widening projects. They're spending $115 million in East Brisbane widening a 700-metre stretch of road from 4 lanes to 6 lanes. That's a gross misuse of taxpayer dollars that could have built, dozens of pedestrian crossings and pocket parks and what have you. But instead, we've got a council that's encouraging high-density development in the inner city, but still encouraging a car-centric lifestyle. So I think those developments that encourage walkable neighbourhoods, that have flow-through lobbies where people are encouraged to not take the car out of the basement, but just walk to the street and catch local public transport is a lot better. But then we have to talk about public transport, which is another fun conversation.
So
Natalie?
I guess just to unpack a few things there, for me, again, it's those rules. So, it's actually a lot of the rules that we have around planning have mounted because of complaint. And so, parking is one of them. I mean, my understanding is the complaints to the call centre at Brisbane City Council, the top complaint, twice as many as the second top complaint is about not having enough car parking. So then that becomes a requirement. It's a minimum. Like we have clients who don't want to meet that minimum, but then that's all the objections we get. Oh, they haven't provided the right number of car parking. So there's this this balance that we have to have. We need to create more flexibility. I mean, it's a flexible planning system, but height and car parking seem to be the two things that everyone gets obsessed about, and they actually increase the number of car parks we have to have. Even in the inner city where you've got a cap on car parking, not a minimum, that's only for businesses, that's not for residents. residents. So as soon as you put residents in, you need to have car parking again. And that has come about from NIMBY behaviour. Maybe it's old NIMBY behaviour and people are changing their mind, but that's another reason that we need performance-based planning, because there is always a plan lag. It takes a while to change legislation, so we need to have it more flexible as we change our behaviours. Rooftops, that is one of my pet hates. I love rooftops. I hate that you can't put shade over them, because that's a story.
Yeah.
Bloody hell. We need to, stop this obsession about stories, because any developer that wants to choose the easy path so that they don't get hijacked by the NIMBY, 2.5 years in court, will go to the acceptable outcome of height. They're not going to waste that on a shade over a swimming pool on the rooftop, because that's a story. That's impact accessible, that's objections, and that's not just a court case about height anymore, that's a court case about everything. We have to focus on what these things are and free up the rules.
I've got a pretty revolutionary question. Like, if we had to start from scratch and design a planning system without any of the constraints that we have at the moment, is it anything like we've got now?
No.
No?
Yeah, well, it's going to take a long time to change. I think that's the problem. Like, yes, we might all have a different opinion.
What is utopia? I mean,
I can rant about this all day, but you go first.
I'll give you a minute each. Yeah.
Okay, you go first.
Well, I think we need a more discursive culture where residents have the knowledge and vocabulary to have conversations about town planning and not feel like those discussions are being outsourced to experts or bureaucrats in City Hall. We need a city where residents feel like that when they go along to a community consultation that there'll actually be some tangible outcome to that. And that will mean that residents have more faith in the system and are more likely to become YIMBYs and engage in less adversarial tactics. But to move to that space, we need to decentralise decision-making processes. Right now, we have one city councillor in Brisbane for every 30,000 residents. That's very unrepresentative, and that means that residents don't feel listened to by their local councillor, but it also means that the vast majority of decisions about urban planning end up being made by public servants who aren't directly accountable to the electorate and aren't having good feedback mechanisms with the electorate. So I would suggest that really what we need to, like my utopia is where residents have the time and energy. They're not working 50 hours a week, so they can come along to community planning sessions, they can get involved, they can have those nuanced evidence-based discussions, and we can win people over to the idea of density and walkable neighbourhoods. We're a long way away from that at the moment, but I think the first step starts with decentralising power through things like citizen juries, community voting, participatory budgeting, deliberative democracy strategies that give more people a voice, and as a result, they will be more rational and reasonable rather than just objecting because they feel powerless.
And do you think in time, and we'll get to Natalie's response in a second, but do you think in time through the blockchain technologies that are coming forward and the ability to actually have more of a truly democratic process, do you think these things will be, like in 5 years' time, do you think people will vote on DAs?
I don't think I don't want people voting on DAs, but I want people voting on the neighbourhood plans and those broader decisions, because that means if let's say a council couldn't approve a neighbourhood plan unless there was majority support from the community. Shock horror, it sounds crazy, the NIMBYs will go nuts. But what would actually happen is that councils and the property industry would do a better job of advocating and justifying their arguments for density. You'd see councils engaging in more realistic and nuanced conversation at the outset. And then in order to get the vote of the residents, the neighbourhood plan would be passed with broad legitimacy and acceptance. At the moment, while we might say that neighbourhood plans involve the community, they don't really. One of the big neighbourhood plans in my area was passed a few years ago. Thousands of signatures against it, big protests, lots of objections, still got rammed through. So now, even when developments comply with that neighbourhood plan and are completely under the acceptable outcomes, residents are still like, no, we don't want that, because they never assented to that and they would never give in a meaningful say. West End residents get sustainability. They're all like really green, and they're all on board with the idea of densification, but they're not on board with the idea of being completely locked out of the process. And I've actually seen over the course of my time in the inner city, residents who were previously in favour of high density have turned against it because they see that it's driven by profit rather than community need.
Interesting. What's your utopia, Natalie?
My utopia is like when, the protesters are out there saying, yes, build development, come on, we need more of it. I think for me, utopia would be, partly having a real conversation when, there is a level playing field of information out there, but it's also, having a development application that I love and I'm proud of and I lodge and I get people putting in submissions saying that they support it. And I guess at the end of the day, it is about having a planning scheme where people have actually been engaged in writing it rather than reacting to every project that gets proposed, because that's the pointy end, that's when someone's money's on the line. You know, it's a risky business, and you know, every development that's impact accessible has to build in a factor of, yeah, we could still be in court 2.5 years later, or, you know, going up to the High Court. So I guess for me, utopia would be people saying yes, people out there saying yes, and having much more debate at the planning scheme making, but a reasonable debate. I don't want to just have a debate, you know, and issues put on the table and those rules getting longer and longer. Utopia means shorter planning schemes, more as of right development. Let's just get on with it.
So Brisbane's bold vision, right? We spoke about it yesterday, Kate, with Malcolm Middleton, government architect. I think it was unanimously agreed by the panel that we truly need a big, bold vision. What is a big, bold vision for Brisbane, Jono? What do you see as our unique identity that we can push forward with something to truly define us?
So obviously I'm going to go on the whole greenie rant about like bike lanes and leafy streets and solar panels on every rooftop and all that.
Bigger than that.
But see, this is the thing. I think we have this weird cultural cringe where we want to have the biggest landmark in the world and we want to be like the city that everyone wants to travel to. But actually, like, life is pretty sick in Brisbane at the moment. And we don't have to be like this really big, shiny thing. Like, I think a lot of residents really detest the term New World City. Like, it's popular within our circles. But there are a whole lot of people who really resent that because they like the sense that Brisbane is a community. They like the idea of like, it's neither a concrete jungle nor a small town. It's that sort of happy medium. And maybe like my bold vision is one of social equity, where everyone can afford a place to live and where we don't have 20,000 empty dwellings, long-term empty dwellings in Brisbane and thousands of people homeless. There are 20,000 people homeless in Brisbane and between 20 and 30,000 empty dwellings. That is a broken system. And that's not because of an overly burdensome planning system. It's because housing is treated as a speculative commodity. It's not about over-regulation. It's about greedy investors and land bankers who would rather leave properties empty than rent them out cheaply. And that's why I'm so critical of increasing supply through the private sector, because I'm not seeing those people getting housed.
Natalie?
Wow. I guess for me, the bold vision for Brisbane is, I'm happy with the term New World City, whatever it is. I think we are a world of cities now, less so countries, particularly in America. People are more happy to identify with their city these days. And so I think it's about, you know, really sharing what we think is our city's identity. And that might be different precincts, and, you know, people in West End might feel like they've got a very different identity to other parts of Brisbane, but I think that's what makes it all up. It's a big jigsaw puzzle. And I guess I didn't catch all of Malcolm's talk, but I liked his discussion about the river. I think we are a river city. For me, when I travel around the world, I like cities that have something unique or some sort of identity. And for us, I think that is our windy Covey River. And I love that there's some star architects out there that are putting their sights on Brisbane. You know, I love that Zaha Hadid, you know, now passed, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll have a project in our city. Woha from Singapore. Plenty of local, you know, great local architecture. I'm happy with Queen's Wharf if it's a stunning architectural piece of work on our city that unlocks a scary part of the bikeway, actually, and opens that up to more public land on the river, gets people there, you know, put some new facilities in. I'm just happy to see some exciting projects happening in our city.
I've been talking to a couple of water catchment experts lately, and they say it's quite possible to clean up the Brisbane River to the point where it's clean enough to swim in. You'd still have to have some shark nets, but can you imagine what that would do for tourism and the identity of the city if everyone doesn't have to drive 3 hours up the highway to the beach, but you just go down to the river and have a swim? Like, that's a bit utopian, but it's entirely possible. We have the technology, we have the know-how, we just lack the political will for those sorts of things. Instead, we build casinos where we rip money out of the pockets of problem gamblers and say, look, we're activating the inner city, don't worry about all those poor people who are losing millions and millions of dollars a year through poker machines.
Jono, I'll leave swimming in the Brisbane River to you. and I'll leave Zaha Hadid and Promoting Brisbane to Natalie. Would you please thank Jonathan and Natalie
Well done, mate.
for a very respectful, very good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Cheers, Alan.
Cheers.